Thank you. Another Wednesday night. I'm sitting on the couch in Dino and Yusufi's living room, surrounded by dark wood paneling and old hand-drawn maps of Istanbul neighborhoods. A stained glass lamp casts long shadows on the wall, and my head swims in the echoes of the heavy Avaliotico that we just played. Dino refills my glass with ouzo and cuts it with cold water. I don't know how many I've had, 5, 6 maybe? A little too much and just enough. I take another olive from the plate on the coffee table, separate the pit from the salty flesh with my teeth, and spit it out into the space between my thumb and cupped forefinger. Christo picks up his clarinet, runs the tip of his tongue over his lips, puts the reed to his mouth and blows a long note, licking at the pitches a wet half-step above and below it. Reminds me of something, I'm not sure what. I close my eyes, think for a minute against a blank sky, and open them again. Dino picks up his hammers, hits a chord on the shaduri. We look at each other, at the empty cups on the table, and back at each other. Almost in unison, with a Skypey time lag, we both exclaim, "Potirakia!" Shot glasses, the name of the tune we're looking for. Everyone laughs, that slightly drunk laughter with an edge of embarrassment and the recognition that this wouldn't have been nearly as funny a few hours ago, although it will be when we remember it next week. Dino plays the first phrase, a lopsided, deliberately drunk little statement, and the clock chimes 11:30. Stati leaps from the love seat, spreads his arms, and starts to spin. I drop my pit onto the dish, and like so many times before and since, pick up the bow. In this paper, I examine the intersection between the sense of taste and the sense of time in the musical practices of the Boston area's Greek-American community. Specifically, I focus on the descendants of immigrants from the island of Lesbos, which is that red thing right there, and the Aegean coast of Anatolia, present-day Turkey. So that we're clear, in Greek, the word Anatolia, the land of the rising sun, means the entire Anatolian peninsula, what is all present-day Turkey, including all of the islands that belong to the Republic of Greece that are next to it. Until 1922, for millennia, there was no separation between that mainland and the islands, culturally, politically, in any way. That's less than 100 years old. So these people's regional music and culinary traditions are distinctive, rich in historical and cultural significance, and deeply interrelated. So my goal here is twofold. One, to propose a sensorium-centered theoretical framework for investigating how cultural knowledge is constructed at the intersections of sociality, music, and memory. And two, to tease out a few of the specific ways in which the culinary and musical traditions of Greek Anatolia exist within each other in the cultural life of this particular immigrant community. So a circumstantial association between music, food, and alcohol may very well be universal. As we all know, they tend to happen together. And examples of culinary terms as mnemonic metaphor to describe some aspect of music abound. So we can think about grooves being described as hot or sweet or greasy or this kind of thing. Here, though, I'll focus on a culturally specific level of culinary metaphor that goes beyond mere associations and hints at a sensory symbiosis that lives at the heart of musically enacted Anatolian Greek sociality. On this level, which I call didactic metaphor, the culinary or gustemic, in other words having to do with taste and food writ large, heavy and drunk, or heaviness and drunkenness, are used to describe and prescribe the ideal temporal relationships performed in the music and steps of the two dances most representative of Anatolian Greek music. These performances are saturated with the co-presence of multiple times, historical, memorial, subjective, and musical pasts, presents, and futures. An examination of this inherent polytemporality is essential to an understanding of how memory works in the lives of Anatolian Greeks and their descendants to create and sustain social bonds. So this approach to the relationship between time, memory, and music in Anatolian Greek culture, in diaspora particularly, seems to me a fruitful one not only because I perceive clear connections between the realms of the culinary and the explicitly expressive arts, but also because my own personal initiation to the world of this music came through the sociable sharing of food and drink, hence the anecdote at the beginning. Accordingly, my argument here is fundamentally based on what in anthropology is usually called commensality, the social organization and rules of sharing nourishment, broadly speaking, eating to make friends, we could say. I suggest, though, that we probe deeper into the mechanics of this universal human phenomenon by looking very closely at how social and musical meaning are created and reinforced through the collective preparation, consumption, and discourse around food and music in specific communities. To do this with Anatolian Greek music and food ways, I'll take as a starting point Nadia Sherematachis's more nuanced definition of commensality as the exchange of sensory memories and emotions, and of substances and objects incarnating memory and feeling. The emphasis on the simultaneous exchange of sensory things, sensory-based memories, and all that accompanies them suggests what I call consensual commensality, invoking both the etymological and commonly accepted meanings of these words. So consensual, all the senses operating together willingly, and commensalities, sharing of effectively charged things at the common table. Mensa, table in Latin. So the consensual commensality practiced by my Anatolian Greek interlocutors is their primary means of transmitting, performing, debating, and enjoying their culinary and musical traditions, creating and accessing memories, and living out their identities as social beings. In other words, co-constructing the knowledge of what it means to be who they are. Music and foodways are above all systems of sensory knowledge, predicated on the exchange of memory, emotion, and the sounds and substances that contain and invoke them. The musically framed consensual commensality, particular to the Anatolian Greek community in this region, as well as in Lesbos, gives us concrete evidence of a wider Aegean system of bodily cultural knowledge and its situated transmission, a phenomenon that has mostly been studied through non-musical ethnographic work. My attempt to describe this particular aspect of the system in explicitly sensory terms owes much to an idea central to the recent sensory turn, so-called, in the social sciences, and one that's gaining traction in neuroscience, that the modern concept of the senses as detached from each other, as separate utilitarian instruments, is fundamentally flawed and deeply misleading. When we speak of taste, smell, touch, hearing, sight, time, or whatever other senses we can identify, we're simply describing, according to this view, one aspect of a unified sensorium that many researchers suggest is nothing less than the mind itself, the organism's means of dynamic interaction with its environment. So if our sense of time is indeed part of this unified sensorium, what can the confluence of music and memory tell us about the sensory orientations particular to this culture, how the Anatolian Greek sensorium is tuned and timed? The situatedness of the consensual commensality that makes the collective experience of food and music possible in this community points toward an answer to this question in the form of what's called prospective memory. Anthropologist Mary Douglas was the first to systematically undertake a structuralist analysis of not only meals, but also significantly the relations between them. She viewed each meal as a system of analogies recalling the basic structure of other meals, by which the part, Wednesday night dinner, say, recalls the whole, the entirety of the pattern of dinners over a period of time, be it a summer or an entire life. The key here is the ritual aspect of the event, the linking of past, present, and future that defines what a meal or a church service or a lecture or a music session actually is. The co-presence of these multiple temporalities is what makes an event a ritual in the first place, and is dependent on not only our ability to remember past events and relate them to the present one, but also on what David Sutton, expanding on Husserl's ideas of retention and protension, calls prospective memory. The practice by which participants in these gatherings plan in the present to remember events in the future. Prospective memory, suggests Sutton, orients people toward future memories that will be created through the commensal consumption of food. We can say the same about musicking, surely, as the interdependence of ritualized and everyday memory that's so characteristic of meals is also eminently present in the commensal exchange of effective sound at jam sessions, concerts, recitals, and dances. In fact, I argue, the polytemporality of the present can most clearly be sensed, tasted, heard, seen, felt, smelled, and remembered in the explicitly musical feasts, or in this context, what we call glendis, that characterize sociality. So the mnemonic polytemporality of the culinary and musical event, the dynamic co-presence of past, present, and future at any given moment, and the subject's ability to access and project them, is also a defining structural feature of much of the music and dancing that animates these gatherings in the Anatolian Greek community, and is explicitly referenced on the culturally specific level of discourse that I talked about before, what I call didactic metaphor. Rooted in the gustemic or culinary concepts of heaviness and drunkenness, these didactic metaphors simultaneously describe the sound and feel of music and dancing, and prescribe how to properly perform and interpret them. This is a particularly useful example, I argue, of how music works in conjunction with situated consensual commensality and this prospective memory, because these metaphors are both made possible by the inherent polytemporality of the social present and explicitly engage with the polytemporality of music in the moment, the co-presence of multiple streams of temporal organization that characterize the typical Anatolian Greek sound and feel of the two dances most associated with this region, the karsilamas and the zebekiko. So the karsilamas and the zebekiko share a similar rhythmic structure, architecture. Can you see that? Is that legible? Can we like turn down the blinds? Yeah. So while we wait. Okay, great. It'll happen. So they share this similar 9-pulse cycle, here it's notated in 9/8 for ease of reading, that gives a lopsided feel to the music and the physical movement to the dancer's body, both of which tend to suspend their motion on the night beat of the cycle. Thank you so much. So here we see the typical rhythmic cell of the Karsilamas and Zebekiko. So it's usually the same. The Karsilamas is faster. The Zebekiko is what we're going to talk about. So if we count, I'll clap it. Clap along with me if you don't mind. 7, 8, 9. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Like that, okay? So you see how there's a suspension on the 9 going into the 1. So, true to its name, karşılama, which means face-to-face in Turkish, the lesbian or Anatolian Greek karsilamas is generally danced by two men who face each other and perform the same or similar steps. Though it exists in a variety of tempos, the version most enthusiastically embraced by Anatolian Greeks both in Greece and in diaspora, and universally labeled most authentically Anatolian, is the slower, or heavier, the word we use is varis, style reminiscent of the way the usually much slower Zebekiko is performed in other parts of Greece and Turkey. What I showed was a typical Zebekiko. Unlike the aggressive and acrobatic Zebekiko typically performed in Greek nightclubs today by a solo male dancer, if you've ever been to a Greek nightclub or a Greek wedding, you've seen the guys come up and people throw money at them, everybody gets in a circle and they do all this acrobatic stuff. That's the Zebekiko. The Anatolian Greek Zebekiko, like the Karsilamas, is usually danced in pairs. It's not a solo dance, with two men improvising their steps in dialogue both with the conventions of form and style and with each other's performance in the moment. Itself, I think, an embodied metaphor of this consensual commensality I was speaking of before. And all of this is against the backdrop of the musical feast. There's always food and alcohol involved. Their movements are fluid and elastic, the tunes are sparse and expansive, and above all, they're performed very slowly, allowing both dancers and musicians ample time to improvise in terms of bodily and melodic gesture and phrasing. Like the Karsilamas, the ideal Anatolian Greek Zebekiko is immediately recognizable for this heavy groove, which lays so far behind the beat, as we might say, that it seems to slow down as the energy intensifies. So why, then, is this groove, is this framework, and especially of the Zebekiko, universally labeled with the adjective varis, heavy, rather than in Greek argos, or slow? I've never heard somebody say play it slower. We have to play this slow. It's always heavy, right? Heaviness is a trait widely associated in Greek culture with masculine toughness, and these dances are traditionally performed by men. However, I propose an implicit connection here to Asia Minor, lesbian, Greek Anatolian discourse about food, especially what Anatolian Greeks see as a distinctive Eastern influence in their culinary tradition that distinguishes it from other regional Greek cuisines and allies it with this older Eastern aesthetic. Lesbians and Anatolian Greeks tend to describe their food preferences with the same adjective, varis, heavy, as they do these dances, citing the copious amounts of olive oil, spices, garlic, onions, fish heads, and unusual combinations of flavors, such as pork and quince, which is a very characteristic dish. Our food is heavy. Tofai masine vari. A lot of those other Greeks can't handle it. An older woman from the lesbian community tells me, using culinary weight to distinguish herself from her less iron-stomached co-religionists. A few days later, her nephew uses almost the exact same words to critique a non-Anatolian Greek's unsuccessful attempt to dance to a lesbian Zebekiko at a Paris social. It's too heavy for him, he said. He can't handle it. Anatolian Greeks see a connection to Turkish cuisine, music, and dance, all of which they also consider rich, heavy, and aesthetically overpowering to Greeks unfamiliar with these traditions, in both name and substance. Though the Anatolian Greek groove of the Karsilamas and Zebekiko is described as heavy, and the dancing is patient and deliberate, it's never plodding. The dancers are light on their feet and frequently improvise small hops, kicks, turns, and slaps that emphasize the subdivisions of the rhythmic pulses that we saw, interact with the melody, and break up the monotony of the typical steps. In the following video, from the Greek television program Otopos ke to Tragoudhitu, can you help me? Which is a program called The Place in Its Song. We can see all of this in the performance of lesbian dancer Ignatios Pipinis and two members. That's a great name, actually. His name even, Pipinis, means like cucumber. So it's even a food reference. And two members of a dance, I just realized that now. Two members of a dance group. So we'll see him and then two members of a dance group from a neighboring village where he's from. Arms spread wide in the typical Zebekiko style, said to indicate the posture of a hawk in flight. They seem to glide around the floor, at once focused, graceful, and brash, the physical power and effective control of ideal Greek masculinity. Okay, that's great. That's fine. And on full display. So we're just going to play from here, and hopefully you'll be able to hear it. Great, I will. Whoops. Here you go. Mr. Cucumber, where are you? Oh, the video's not coming through. Sorry. No problem. So notice in this clip, first it's Mr. Pipinis dancing in a coffee house state. This is also, I know who a few of these people are. This is what they would do even if the cameras were not there. 7, 8, 9. And this is an example of the Zebekiko two men dancing together. So we get an idea. Okay. Over this heavy groove, the melodies of the Karsilamas, and especially of the Zebekiko, expand and contract, crushing some notes together in unevenly compacted phrases and stretching others over subdivisions and rhythmic cells in deliberately random-sounding gestures, as if the musician were barely in control of himself or his instrument. So listen now to the melody of that same tune that they were playing, and let's notice how infrequently the melody lines up with the offbeats and even the pulses of the groove. It often seems that the melody is barely hanging on to its center of gravity, drunkenly grasping for support as it tries to walk across the room. So this is where you're going to help me. So notice, just so we can really feel what's going on, don't listen to me too much, because it might confuse you. Just feel like we're together. So let's just start by clapping this together. Great. Okay. Excellent. So 7, 8, 9. 1, 2. Do it again. 9, 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 1. Right? Excellent. Thank you. So my Anatolian Greek musician and dancer friends consistently describe this approach to Zebekiko phrasing using exactly the same metaphor. It's got to sound more drunk, man, they would frequently respond when I asked for advice about how to achieve a more appropriate style on the violin. I grew up with a completely different way of playing this music. So listen to these guys, says Dino, putting on a CD of elderly lesbian musicians sent to him by his cousin back on the island. They're drunk all the time. That's how they get that feel. When I remark, reading the liner notes, that the violinist is from Plomari, a village famous for its potent brand of ouzo, he raises his eyebrow knowingly, as if to say, well, are you surprised? This alcoholic metaphor references a very real trope of Greek masculinity that we can clearly perceive in the physical and musical language, as well as the homosocial context of these dances. Traditionally, both the Karsilamas and Zebekiko are the exclusive provenance of men, who are called to demonstrate through these dances the agility, bravado, obstinance, and vigor that make up their sense of self-regard, widely known as egoismos, egoism, you could say, cognate. If the moderate Greek feminine ideal is bound to sweetness, as Jane Cohen argues, the excessive masculine ideal is manifested in the barely controlled expansivity of heavy drunkenness, the ability to balance on the tipping point of excessive behavior, simultaneously demonstrating disdain for restrictive social conventions, as well as the self-mastery required to spin on the edge of propriety without losing control, and, along with it, social capital. As Michael Hertzfeld points out, even the most inventive displays of male self-regard must prove acceptable if they're not to backfire. but the truly skilled performer tests and stretches the tolerance of his peers, or in our case here, the underlying rhythmic framework, to the limit. So the ability to hold one's liquor, as it were, is an important skill in a social environment largely predicated on the conspicuous consumption of ouzo and wine, an act both agonistic and commensal. This renders the musically didactic metaphor of drunkenness all the more apt, as it describes a state of psychological and physiological liminality, teetering between control and its dissolution, that mirrors and prescribes the tension between the deliberately heavy time scheme of the rhythmic cycle and the deliberately drunken time scheme of the melody. There's another connection between heaviness, drunkenness, masculinity, and music that surprisingly points toward widely held Greek notions of purity and truth. In popular Greek discourse, the two most masculine drinks, straight ouzo or raki, or grappa, and bitter unsweetened coffee, are commonly referred to as well as heavy, varis, as is the one who drinks them. My Greek Anatolian and lesbian friends love to quote the following line from the chorus of Yannis Markopoulos' 1970 hit, "Tu andra tu bolav vari," the really heavy guy. "Tu ouzo pini aneroto, che ton kafe tu sketo." He drinks his ouzo without water and his coffee unsweetened. The unquoted lines that precede these explicitly equate the intoxicating weight of straight ouzo and the searing bitterness of black Turkish coffee with honesty, trustworthiness, and masculine power, undiluted by water, the drink of those who lack endurance, and unadulterated by feminizing sweetness. This notion of masculine purity and power is at the heart of the musical metaphors of heaviness and intoxication, tools to be wielded by the virtuosic Greek Anatolian man as he dances and plays his way through the social construction of his polytemporal sense of self and community. So the commensal framing of this musical and memorial polytemporality speaks to the ability of culinary metaphors in general to address the embodied passage of time. Again, Nadia Sheremetachis suggests that we take such metaphors seriously, asking, what is fermentation if not history, if not a maturation that occurs through the articulation of time and substance? When we drink a glass of wine, when we eat a piece of cheese, we're consuming the outcome of a historical process, an articulation of time and substance that we further articulate by turning it into part of ourselves, part of our own historical process of continuous change and renewal, a process that creates and depends upon bodily and emotional memory. So this articulation of time and substance is what happens on a biochemical level as we eat, drink, and digest, on a psychological and physiological level as we sing, dance, play, and listen to music, and on a fundamentally sensory level as we move around our world. For Anatolian Greeks and their descendants, consensual commensality, the willful exchange of sensory memories and emotions, and of the substances and objects that incarnate those memories and feelings, is the ground on which they perform all of these gustemic, musical, and sensory acts. It's the field where memories are created, remembered, and projected, nourishing them in the present and lining the shelves of a larder for the future. Like Kazantzakis' Zorba, not the cartoonish rascal commodified by the tourist trade, but the tormented zither-playing Buddhist master of the literary masterpiece, they're engaged in the struggle of turning matter into spirit. Their allies in this struggle in time are the same as his, and all of ours, the social sharing of food, movement, and musical sound, and the marshalling of the entire sensorium in order to live, to be, as Henry Miller wrote after his own transformative sojourn in Greece, aware, joyously, drunkenly, serenely, divinely aware.